Hi again, guys, and welcome to episode 35 of Weekend Warriors, the review series for the sports cars of Gran Turismo. And this particular pick is a sports coupe which has been on the game for quite a lot longer than many of the other ones. It's been on Gran Turismo since at least as far back as GT2. I'm not sure if it was on GT1 because I never really got into that game. But it was definitely on the second game. There was a racing version of this car which was very impressive, in fact, and it's been a staple of the GT franchise ever since. And the car is, of course, the Audi TT Quattro, in particular the entry-level model, if you will, the 1.8 Quattro, and this car is actually kind of the basis for the ultimate incarnation of the first generation Quattro called the TT Quattro Sport, which is available on a couple of racing games, probably most notably Test Drive Unlimited, where I believe you could start the game with that car, if I remember correctly. It looks like the 3.2 Quattro in terms of the body kit, the wing, but it distinguishes itself from the rest visually by having a black roof. Inside, it's a two-seater instead of a 4, and it has, interestingly, the 1.8 turbo engine, but with the power of the 3.2, so you have more power but also less weight. And that's a pretty cool car. There was actually one for sale relatively close to me recently, and it's always special to see a TT Sport on the street because they didn't make a huge amount of them. Now, this particular vehicle has that 1.8 engine, although in its initial form it's not tuned to the same level, of course, and this car is, I would say, more fun than the 3.2 model. Now, the 3.2 is a premium, which is a big advantage in its favour, and of course for pure straight line speed, the 3.2 does have the advantage. In terms of fun though, and potentially on some tracks, the 1.8 is not to be overlooked. The engine is much more thumpy, it likes to be worked harder, it doesn't necessarily have as much low down lazy torque as the 3.2 just naturally does, and also I would say the 1.8 is not just a vehicle which feels more fun, but it's a vehicle which has handling that's geared more towards, not necessarily beginners, but more towards people who like to have fun with driving rather than just being the fastest. If you're looking purely for the faster TT Quattro, obviously a 3.2 is the one to go for, but the 1.8 is more for people who like to be a bit different from the crowd and who fancy trying something less obvious. Which of course brings us to the question of specs. What do you actually get for the money, and what kind of alternative is it to the 3.2 litre model? Well, for the price tag of a fraction under 48 grand, which isn't too bad a price, you get, of course, a 1.8 turbo engine, all-wheel drive as the Quattro name dictates, and some interesting numbers. 421 horsepower, which is pretty good, 332 foot-pounds of torque, which I would say is also perhaps surprisingly good for a smaller capacity engine. And although it's certainly not a super lightweight vehicle, being 1142 kilos even after upgrades, it certainly isn't overly heavy, given the fact that it's a well-equipped and well-built vehicle with all-wheel drive. The horsepower per tonne sits at just under 370, which isn't too bad, and the PP is perhaps its only downfall. The PP is, to be honest, a little too high, I would say, at 512. Now, it's not a bad car at that level, but it would be better suited if it was just over 500, maybe 502, 503. That would feel, I think, more accurate to how good the car actually is. So, for me personally, there isn't a huge discrepancy between how good it actually is and how good it's presented as being, but you should be careful where you choose to use it and how good you actually expect the car to be. It's certainly not a bad car by any means, but it won't necessarily dominate the track. It won't necessarily dominate any track, in fact. The TT Quattro is one of those vehicles, not just in 1.8 form, but also the 3.2, and to some degree the newer models as well, that isn't necessarily the kind of car which experienced drivers will go to first. If you're more of an experienced driver, you'll probably look more to something with rear-wheel drive in the coupe category, maybe a two-seater sports car like a TVR. For beginners, though, there are very few sports coupes which I would actually say are better than the TT Quattro. It's a fantastic beginner's car, and I would say the 1.8 in particular is even better in that regard than the 3.2. The TT 1.8 is also kind of a sleeper. It's kind of not at the same time, because technically it is a sports car, but at the same time, if somebody sees you using one, they won't necessarily take you too seriously, and that can work to your advantage. Overall, it's a relatively simple review, because what I personally find with the TT Quattro of any style, to some degree, is that they are cars that aren't necessarily the most exciting to drive, but they do just get the job done. And that's kind of a German trait in general, but Audis in particular have that tendency that they aren't necessarily as exciting as something like a BMW M3 or a Z4, but they are easier to drive, easier to push to their limit, generally are cheaper, and certainly are more beginner friendly. Plus, a big advantage of the TT Quattro, as its name again suggests, is that all-wheel drive. And as such, once you take the car off-road, it will leave most of its rivals in the dust, because you just get so much more traction. On the road, it's okay. Off-road, it's excellent. So overall, that's it for this particular review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.